Okay, well, welcome everyone to what is the 11th Social Histories of the Russian Revolution public talk. Thank you, all of you, for coming, and apologies again for the strange circumstances in which we're doing this. We are completely fully booked about, I think, 2 weeks ago, and we managed to secure an extra overspill room where there are about 40 plus people just now watching this as we speak. So thanks to you two as well, all of you in there. This series has been running now, Social Histories of the Russian Revolution, for around a year. And we initiated this series, obviously, because we're fast approaching the centenary of the October Revolution. But we gave it the name Social Histories of the Russian Revolution for a very specific set of reasons. Now, the events of 1917 are well known. In particular, the events of 1917 from the perspective of the leadership, the Bolshevik leadership and leadership of other political parties, are very well known. Those debates are contested, and we've been contesting them for well a century now. We wanted to do something different with this series. We wanted to look at the revolution from the perspective of the men and women, the working class participants and peasant participants in the revolution. Those who participated in changing history and making history. We wanted to get to grips with the social history of the Russian Revolution, and we've been doing that every month or so with these talks. Tonight we're going to do it from a really special perspective, and I won't say any more about that because our wonderful chair is going to tell you a bit more about that. Liz Lester will be our chair once again this evening. For those of you who haven't met Liz before, she did her degree here at Birkbeck, of all places, and for 14 years she was chair of the Camden Unison local government branch. She's also been a tutor for Unite and the Workers' Educational Association, where she has taught on women's history and women's radical history in the late 19th century. And like the organisers of this Social Histories of the Russian Revolution series, she's a socialist, an activist, and a trade unionist. So, Liz, over to you.
Thanks, President. First of all, as you'll be aware, this is being videoed this evening, so the talk can be made available to a wider audience on YouTube. So if people could put their phones off or put them on silent, that would be really appreciated. But the audience and the people in the discussion will not be filmed when they ask questions. It's really to get the speaker and his points on the YouTube. Gleb Albert from the University of Zurich, who's sitting next to me, is going to speak about early Soviet society and world revolution, 1917 to 1927. Gleb will speak for about half an hour, possibly a little more, and then we'll have at least another hour for questions, discussion, and for his further comments. I'll try to bring as many people into the discussion as possible, so if you've spoken once and you don't get called again, please understand it's to try and give as many people as possible a chance to participate in these really important discussions. At the end, we'll take a few minutes, as people will know who've been to these before, for any announcements of relevant meetings, demonstrations, or other activities that people would like to talk about. And then the organizers invite everyone to the Institute of Education bar, where there's a lot of space and a lot of capacity, I'm sure, for everyone who wants to have a drink. When the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, they did so on the premise that their new state would not stay isolated. This was an extremely important part of the revolution. They were counting on the masses in Europe to overthrow their governments, end World War I, and with Soviet Russia form a socialist commonwealth. This didn't happen. Was this just the concern of the Soviet political elites? Did the rank and file activists and the general population, absorbed by the day-to-day struggle for survival, ignore the revolutionary events abroad? Or did some of them share the Bolshevik vision of a world revolution? These are some of the issues that we hope we'll be hearing about tonight. The talk is based on a great deal of archival research, and just a few words about Gleb. He was born in Moscow and emigrated to Germany at a young age. He studied in Cologne and in Krakow. He worked as a research assistant at the University of Mannheim in a project on the Communist International, and afterwards wrote his dissertation on the exact topic that he's going to speak about tonight. There's a monograph based on his dissertation, came out in May this year, The Charisma of World Revolution, revolutionary internationalism in early Soviet society, 1917 to 1927. Unfortunately, this is still only in German, but a translation is in the offing. So we look forward very much to hear Gleb's talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am amazed by this turnout, how many people came. Wow, I really didn't expect that. Please forgive my imperfect English. Yeah, and in order to save time, I'll just, let me just begin. And I'll begin with a picture that you might have seen on the announcements for this event, namely this one. So you see it's a part of a book issued in 1989 called The Unpublished Revolution. So many photographs from 1917 could be seen in this book for the very first time after the events. Photographs that had not been shown, had been hidden during Soviet times. And this photograph is very interesting because if you look at the posters on this demonstration in Petrograd on the 18th of June 1917. So which poster got chosen by the editors of the book to be mentioned in the caption? So the caption says, members of the Bolshevik committee carry a banner that proclaims, "Long live the social revolution." And this is this black banner in the middle. But what about the much bigger and probably colorful banner in the forefront? It says, "Long live the International." And I mean, it's interesting that the editors of the book chose to highlight this other poster that was rather like addressing concrete political issues of power and so on, and not this banner of internationalism, basically. And I mean, it's quite symbolic for the historiographical treatment of this subject, like of the subject of what importance did internationalist ideas and internationalist practices have in 1917 and the years afterwards, because it's there, it's on the surface. If you look at, I don't know, early avant-garde art, early Bolshevik leaflets, I mean, I don't even need to talk about the writings and the speeches of the leaders. Like, world revolution is all over the place. But historians, and particularly social historians of the early Soviet Union, do not really take it seriously, because they see it rather as just as mere propaganda content that was not really taken up by the population, by the masses, and so on. So basically, the topic is really like on this photo, in plain sight but invisible. My talk will basically focus on three groups within, or three strata within early Soviet society. So it's first of all the party elites, then the rank and file within the party, the rank and file activists within the party, and the general population, which is of course the most hard topic to grasp. First of all, in order not to disappoint anyone, this will not really be a talk about world revolution itself. So there will be very little said about the Comintern, about revolutions and attempts for revolution that took place in Western Europe and so on. But of course we can talk about that in the discussion. But in tune with the name of the lecture series, this is really supposed to be a social history of world revolution, if you will, in the early Soviet Union. Like, is there a social history of world revolution at all in the early Soviet Union? And if there is, how we are to write it, and who are the protagonists of this history. So the protagonists are to be found in these three groups I just mentioned. I will, however, skip the part on, Marxist theory that was crucial for the Bolsheviks' assumptions in terms of a expectedly imminent world revolution, as I believe most of you in the room are familiar with it, even probably much better than I am. I mean, I just need to mention Lenin's theory of imperialism and Trotsky's and Pavus's theory of permanent revolution. However, if we go straight to political decision-making in 1917, when the Bolshevik leadership discussed whether to take power in early October 1917. Historiography, and even more so popular history and our popular perceptions of 1917, it's more focused on, well, the Bolsheviks discussed whether they can take power and whether they can keep it. But if you look at the debates themselves, it becomes quite evident that the question of revolution abroad was equally important, while Zinoviev and Kamenev, opposing the bid for power, were arguing that the European workers are not ready for taking power yet, and thus socialism in Russia would be isolated. Lenin argued to the contrary, that not taking power now in Russia would be a betrayal, again, of the European workers, since they were counting on a Russian revolution. Of course, it's a very schematic rundown of these debates, but it's just to point out how important the expectations for an imminent revolution, for imminent revolutions abroad, were for the decision of the Bolsheviks to take power. And when the Bolsheviks in the end did take power in November, their hopes in the following 6 years, right up to 1923 and beyond, were circulating around whether revolution happens abroad or not. Why? Because the Bolshevik leaders were convinced that Soviet Russia would not survive on its own in a long perspective. And that the Russian Revolution, that it happened so early, is not necessarily like a logic of history, but rather a combination of circumstances, as Lenin pointed out already in his letter to Swiss workers in April 1917. So not only were the Bolshevik leaders convinced that the Russian Revolution, both February and October, happened in large parts due to a special and perhaps untypical conjuncture of circumstances, but they were also willing to support the, one could say, the real revolution, the big revolution coming in the industrialized countries. And that would immediately, as they expected, help Soviet Russia to get on its feet. In 1918, in late 1918, when the German Revolution was about to begin, Lenin wrote in a private letter to Trotsky and Yakov Sverdlov, quote, "Even if we all will die, we must help the German workers to bring about their own revolution." And this is not a propaganda pamphlet, this is the private communication among Bolshevik leaders. The German November Revolution of 1918 was of course a major event, but not the only event that fueled the Bolsheviks' hopes for not staying isolated in the post-revolutionary years. There were the Council Republics in Bavaria and in Hungary in 1919, the Italian Biennio Rosso in 1919, 1920, the Red Clydeside, for example, the German so-called March Action of 1921, the German October of 1923, the struggles in China in 1927. But all of these events resulted in defeat, at least from the Bolshevik standpoint. Despite this series of defeats, Stalin's and Bukharin's idea of 1925, that one could build socialism in one single country, was considered strange, bewildering, or even outrageous by large strata within the party, at least among the party intellectuals. However, those defeats I just mentioned, of course, they proved a fertile ground for the idea amongst those who were too tired to wait, especially among the rank and file. Trotsky and his followers kept on clinging to the idea that isolated socialism in Russia was not only futile, but also not really a desirable outcome. Like in mid-1924, Trotsky could still gather laughter and applause at the All-Union Librarian Congress with the following statement: "In about 15 to 20 years, the same English proletariat will lead us, like us as in Soviet Russia, in the field of construction of socialism. Of course, we will not take offense at this. Do your duty, lead the way. We have waited a long time for this. We, with you, shall win together." End quote. And I mean, this is mid-1924 when the inner party struggle is already going on. So what Trotsky intended to sound like, to sound like optimism, as in expectations in an impending European revolution that was still to come, was brandished as pessimism by the Stalinist agitprop at the same time, namely a pessimism concerning the possibilities of building up socialism in one single country. And of course, as we all know, the Stalinist faction won. Such socialism was built in the end, and with all the dreadful consequences we are all aware of. But, and now we really have to delve into social history here, how exactly these debates did resonate in the lower ranks of the party and society at large. When the Austrian travel writer Arthur Hollitscher visited Moscow in 1921, he complained a lot about Moscow, but he also complained about the Soviet press, as he writes, it consisted nearly exclusively of news about the progress of world revolution, which are hammered into the heads of the reader and eventually arouse rage and repulsion. I mean, on the one hand, of course, this is a quite true depiction of the early Soviet press, if you look at the headlines. But then again, the travel writer Hollitscher was probably not the one supposed to read these headlines. Like, he was not the main addressee of this sort of content. It was rather the enthusiastic revolutionary activists who drew their energy from news about revolts, strikes, and revolutions abroad. But why were they interested at all in revolutions abroad? And first of all, how did the interest came to be? And just to remind once again, we are talking here not about party intellectuals who traveled abroad, who were well read in Marxist theory and so on. I'm talking about the common guys in the party, the organizers in the villages, and so on. So how to explain this interest, which manifests itself in private letters and in diaries? I will talk about it later on. So I think there are two factors. First of all, we have really a sort of globalization of provincial life during World War I. So from 1914 onwards, all of a sudden, everyone knows someone or knows someone who fights somewhere in Europe, who perhaps died somewhere in Europe, who is wounded somewhere in Europe. And all of a sudden, even if you're sitting in the most remote village, you have to realize, like, what is this continent? What is this world? I mean, it's a world war after all. Alphabetization makes actually a huge boost in the Soviet provinces during World War I, because all of a sudden people need to write letters to their relatives on the front. Maps, Europe and world maps, get a rare commodity in the provinces because people want to see how the borders between countries look like and so on. I mean, of course, this is already a precondition for like taking an interest at all in events abroad. And secondly, and this is an equally important part, after the February Revolution in 1927, those those manifestations of culture that were considered part of the revolutionary underground, all of a sudden spill over into the political mainstream. So all these songs, red flags, leaflets that before the revolution could only be spread underground could suddenly be spread in the open. Demonstrations could suddenly take place in the open. Red flags were hoisted even by the government, basically. And in fact, you even had a government that legitimized itself out of the revolution, and in parts even out of the workers' movement, of course, because you had the double government and the Soviet of workers and soldiers' deputies was, of course, very prominent. So what does this mean? It means that also the symbolic references to international socialism and to international solidarity that were prominent in the revolutionary movement underground also became visible for a much broader strata of the population than before, of course. Of course, as we know, with a provisional government unwilling to end the war, the Bolsheviks offered, as it seemed for many back then, the most convincing solutions, like peace without annexations and contributions, land reform, and so on. And of course, this included the internationalist agenda. It were not so much Lenin's elaborations on imperialism or Trotsky's on the permanent revolution, but this very simple message. International brotherhood means end of war. Brotherhood of peoples as an antithesis to the never-ending slaughter. And there was no need for Marxist theory to realize that. And I mean, the protagonists whom I will talk about in a minute, they most likely never ever have read one single line of Marx and probably just a few slogans of Lenin. However, of course, as we know, with the October Revolution 1917, the war did not really cease. Well, first of all, World War I didn't cease, and then, of course, you have civil war in Russia. So, so the war really comes home, one could say. In the conditions of total chaos and the isolation of the provinces and so on. So who would be expected in these horrible circumstances, besides the party intellectuals, to care about world revolution, about some revolutions happening abroad? Well, it were the rank and file activists. Of course, as party cadres in the provinces were rather rare, many joined the party after October 1917 just to take part in being representative of the new regime, out of careerist motives and so on and so forth. But there was still a substantial number of rank and file idealists, those who joined the party out of belief for a new society, and who were at least literate enough to leave their reflections on the situation on paper in forms of letters, diaries, or newspaper articles in the provincial Bolshevik press. And I mean, this is how we as historians know about these people at all. These literate and enthusiastic activists may have been in the minority, and of course they were pretty quickly in the minority as more and more opportunists and careerists came into the party. But due to their more or less higher degree of education and their literacy and so on, they were the ones who produced the content of Bolshevik agitprop in the provinces, like newspaper headlines, leaflets, and so on. So their enthusiasm for world revolution received a larger audience, and thus was also relevant, for a social history of the early Soviet Union. So still I need to answer the question, why did these activists, why was it attractive for them to follow revolutionary developments abroad and even be enthusiastic for them? For such activists, particularly in the provinces, the belief in world revolution functioned as a sort of hope of being delivered from misery. And it was very attractive for very concrete reasons. Such activists were subject to, one could say, a threefold isolation. First of all, the geographical isolation from the centers of the country. So they had a real hard time communicating with the party central organs in Moscow and St. Petersburg if they were sitting somewhere, I don't know, in Irkutsk or even in closer places. Secondly, the isolation from the general population. Yeah, on the one hand, they were the representatives of state power, but it didn't mean at all that they were in the middle of society and appreciated by everyone. Rather the contrary. And thirdly, the isolation within the party from the increasingly opportunist and careerist majority. So these activists, they also felt isolated within the party itself pretty quickly. I would like to illustrate the importance of internationalism for revolutionary activists by presenting two examples of low-level party activists who both were located in the peripheries of Soviet Russia, and both had the habit of keeping diaries, which is very fortunate for a historian. The first one is Nikolai Zhykov, the first chairman of the village Soviet in the village of Mokhcha in northwestern Russia. So this is really not the center of the country. Nominally, he was the highest representative of state power in his village, but in reality, he was considered a disturber of peace and of traditional village life, and thus had to face ongoing hostility from his fellow peasants from the very beginning. So he was basically a village outcast, even though he was the real Bolshevik in the village. And we are speaking about the time after the revolution already. Thus, Zhykov's diary is actually extraordinarily gloomy, full of complaints about peasant ignorance, the remoteness of his village, and also the in his eyes, unrealistic party politics that he had to pursue in this village against his fellow peasants, basically. The only positive diary entries refer not to local or to domestic politics, but to the inherent worldwide transformations he was expecting. in February 1918, he noted down, I've received a few newspapers, got to know that the revolution is stabilizing and that revolutions in other countries are ripening. That means that there are still reasons to be joyful. A few weeks later, without having any fresher news on revolutions abroad, he writes down in his diary that world revolution is a, quote, lovely thing, прелестная вещь, but he doubts whether it is, quote, possible now. The news of the November Revolution in Germany, only a few months later, which could have done away with Zhikov's doubts, do not reach him anymore, because in May 1918 already he is assaulted by fellow peasants and killed with rifle butts. The other rank and file activist in question is Iosif Golubyov, a worker who joined the Minsk branch of the party in March 1917 and was a small party cell organizer throughout the whole Civil War period. In the second half of 1918, he was heading a cell of railroad workers somewhere in the countryside, in what later became Belarusia. As a literate, self-reflective worker who sincerely believed in social revolution, he felt isolated among his careerist and opportunistic comrades, and also he suffered from another isolation, namely being separated from his wife and children, who stayed behind in German-occupied Minsk, while he was in the countryside, hiding basically. The few positive entries in his diary, once again, relate to revolution abroad. And this is how he reacted to the first news about revolution in Germany in early October 1918. Only one thing makes me happy right now, that finally there is a real revolution going on in Germany. That means that soon we will have no front line, and then I can go back to Minsk, fix my affairs a bit, calm down the kids, and stay at one place. That would be quite nice. The German proletariat starts to get conscious. Well, it was about time to erect a new order, to topple the bourgeoisie and free the people from century-old slavery. This is necessary, end quote. And I mean, here we can see how Golubyov's, well, quite like slogan-like and superficial usage of Marxist terminology is intensely intertwined with concrete hopes and concerns which directly concern his everyday life. And internationalism is like the link that links ideology and everyday life in this example, because I mean it's quite obvious he is really depending on a revolution to happen in Germany so that the Kaiser troops leave Minsk and he can go back to his family. But of course for him as a Bolshevik it means more than that. But it also means for him very concrete consequences in his everyday life. And also for Golubyov, the belief in imminent world revolution, what was keeping him going against all odds he encountered in the party itself. At another occasion in late 1918, after being confronted in a party meeting with some claims that he found unjust, he wrote down, and after all that, I'm supposed to work for the party? I received nothing but deepest ungratefulness. The only thing that calms me down is that the European proletariat is on the rise, and the all-encompassing international flame, всенародное пламя in Russian, can fire up at any moment. That's what makes it worth working for the sake of the toiling people. That, like the world revolution, will be the best reward. And of course, we also have to remind ourselves that this is a diary, so this is not something that Golubyov is writing to, let's say, to prove to others that he is a proper Bolshevik. He writes it for himself, and of course he also writes it for himself to prove himself that he is a proper Bolshevik. So this talk about world revolution is of course a very strong tool for these rank and file activists to confirm to themselves that they are true believers in the cause. If they hope in such seemingly abstract things as world revolution. However, as we all know, the German Revolution failed, the Hungarian and Bavarian council republics were toppled, and so on. And in Golubyov's diaries, like if we follow them through the further years, we can observe how desperate he's clinging to any slightest hint towards European revolution. For example, when he writes in November 1919, so a year later, we received information that in France revolution has begun. It's quite unclear what sort of information this is. And councils were formed in some places, like Soviets were formed in some places. This is very good for us. It means that soon there will be peace and one will be able to breathe more freely. Else no patience will be enough to endure all this. And then after France, perhaps the British workers will join in, and then we will topple the bourgeoisie and become stronger. End of quote. However, already in December, Golubyov is, in December 1919, Golubyov complains about all the workers' blood that is being spilled and notes down that this bloodshed will go on, quote, until world revolution will raise its head again. And this will not be too soon, end quote. After that, we find no more hints or no more mentions of international revolution in the diary, and the diary, like the known part of the diary, goes until 1923. Unfortunately, the diary stops in early 23, but by that time, Golubyov, who already quit the party, actually is transformed into a embittered, complaining, politically inactive citizen, basically. Obviously, the belief in world revolution lost plausibility the more revolutions abroad were crushed or did not turn out like communists hoped them to. Nevertheless, among particular strata of activists, this hope remained alive even throughout the 1920s, and even among those who were too young to actively having witnessed World War I, revolution, or even civil war. For example, we have Komsomol members writing letters to be sent to China in 1926, 1927. In masses, like thousands of Komsomols write letters and ask to be sent abroad to fight for revolution. Or young and old party members expressing their urge to fight against Franco in Spain, even 10 years later. And of course, not all, as I already hinted to the fact that not all talk of world revolution was like, we can assume, not with all talk of world revolution, be it in the revolutionary and civil war years, be it in the 1920s, we cannot assume of all of it that it was like fueled by genuine enthusiasm. I mean, whatever genuine enthusiasm is. So, of course, the talk of world revolution was used as a marker of conformity as well. Like, it was actually quite wise for a party member to talk about world revolution instead of talking about domestic or even local affairs. So we can observe quite often that party speakers in the provinces prefer to talk about world revolution in order not to talk about shortages in the villages, or about repressions, or about any other thing that is more problematic to talk about. But what's interesting is that in the course of the 1920s, and of course in the 30s, the discourse of world revolution becomes rather a marker of opposition, of oppositional attitudes. I mean, beginning with the left opposition, of course. The rank and file activists of the left opposition and, of course, of the united opposition, they very prominently talked about world revolution, not only because they were, well, one could say good Marxists, but also because it was a distinction, like a sign of distinction, to distinguish oneself from the Stalinist discourse. But apart from party members, no matter how low-ranking or high-ranking, what did the, one could say, common people think of world revolution? And of course, this is not an easy question to tackle, source-wise, and of course, it's quite a big question. To tackle it, the campaign for the so-called German October in late 1923 is an important point in history. The German October of 1923, I mean, many of you who are familiar with the history of the left opposition in the Soviet Union and so on are of course familiar with the question of whether there will be a revolution in Germany in 1923. But just to sum it up very quickly, I mean, this was the point when the Comintern and the Bolshevik leaders anticipated a German revolution in the second half of 1923 and got involved into large-scale preparations. I mean, on the preparations on the Comintern side and on the side of the Communist Party of Germany are well known. But what is rarely looked upon is that there was a huge propaganda campaign in the Soviet Union in the second half of 1923, preparing the population for German revolution. Of course, as we know now, this German October largely turned out to be a non-event, one could say. Apart from a minuscule uprising in Hamburg, nothing near to a revolution took place. And one could also say that the German fiasco laid, through the disappointment it caused, laid also the groundwork for the acceptance of Stalin's socialism in one country line amongst the party's rank and file. But the 1923 campaign was crucial for another reason as well, because for the first time a campaign concerning an international revolutionary event had to be aimed not just at the Bolshevik members and sympathizers, or like those who are anyway on the side of the regime, but it had to be aimed at the general population. Why? Because the Bolsheviks were convinced that in case of communist victory in Germany in 1923, the capitalist countries would not only try and crush this new Soviet Germany, but also move against the Soviet Union after they would have been finished with Germany. So, and this was a perspective that was talked about very openly. So you have Pravda articles basically saying the same thing. So of course it's a very hard task to motivate the general population for solidarity towards a foreign revolution, despite the same revolution endangering their own peaceful existence. And we have to recall the civil war is just over, basically. So finally there is at least some peace in Soviet society. And now the Bolsheviks have to conduct a campaign that is, well, basically the events which are propagated by this campaign are endangering the same peace. So it becomes a very problematic situation, very hard task to do. This particularity of the 1923 campaign leads to a larger general question. Why, apart from this particular campaign, did the Bolsheviks promote revolutionary internationalism to the general population? I mean, in this case, it's obvious. It had very practical aims. Like in case there really would be a war, they needed the population to be prepared for that. So the 1923 campaign is very much centered around the question: what will happen if there is revolution in Germany and then a new European war breaks out? And the point was to convince the population to look forward to a German revolution nonetheless. So with which arguments could Bolsheviks ask common workers and peasants to look forward to revolutions abroad, or to support revolutions abroad? The discourse of world revolution had several functions for the non-activist parts of the population. During the Civil War, it was used very often to justify the present injustices, as in, when world historical events are going on, one must not complain about some petty things like, well, some people get shot, someone gets their grain stolen, and so on. But world revolution is just around the corner. And I mean, this is an argument that was used quite literally. If you read protocols of like open party meetings, or even like non-party meetings, which were organized by the party for the general population. Also, of course, the hope of world revolution, just like for the rank and file party activists, was supposed to give purpose to the current material suffering. As in, well, now we are suffering, but when world revolution comes, there will be abundance. Also, and this is a quite interesting point, the Bolsheviks hoped to use solidarity with foreign workers and revolutionaries to fight the omnipresent xenophobia in Soviet society, which of course did not disappear after the October Revolution. The hopes expressed, for example, in instruction brochures and the correspondence within the party agitprop apparatus was that, well, if our workers and peasants learn to express solidarity with foreign workers and peasants, then they will probably be a bit more tolerant towards ethnic minorities in our own country. So this was one of the hopes that the Bolsheviks connected to promoting internationalism into the general population. But the most important line of reasoning, however, particularly during the 1923 campaign I just talked about, was the notion of mutual benefit. So, for example, it was argued in the newspapers or by public speakers that if workers in Germany would gain victory, the Russian peasants would get much better machinery to work their crops, or like machinery at all to work their crops, because Germany, well, it was an industrialized country with high developed technology and so on. And it was also portrayed as such in Soviet newspapers, also like not only in revolutionary context. And even solidarity with political prisoners in the West, which became much more prominent, of course, after 1923, when there were many leftist political prisoners in the West. The arguments that the state apparatuses used to evoke solidarity with political prisoners in the West also could employ this notion of mutual benefit. So arguing that those who are rotting in prison right now are the future revolutionary leaders who will, once they are free and once they have conducted their successful revolution, will build up beneficial relations with the Soviet Union, which will then again be good for the economy and so on. So what did the population make of this? I mean, it would not be wrong to answer not much, like if you look at a larger perspective. But the sources, like be it secret police reports, be it unpublished letters to the press, be it written questions that Bolshevik speakers received from the audience, they show a picture that is a bit more complex than that. Like news about foreign revolutionary struggles and the call for solidarity with those did not just evoke two possible responses, like appreciation on the one side and ignorance or rejection on the other side. Those information and news about foreign revolutions and foreign struggles could also be read by the populace in a subversive way. For example, there are numerous secret police reports about people actually rejoicing on the defeat of communists elsewhere instead of mourning it as it was expected. Like, for example, after the Piłsudski putsch in Poland, there were secret police reports reporting that, well, some people are actually spreading these rumors and being happy about it because they expect the communists would have the same fate in the Soviet Union itself. Or people could, of course, also embrace the calls for international solidarity and use them for their own agenda. For example, there are several instances of workers enthusiastically taking up the news of the British miners' strike in 1926, namely workers who themselves were on strike in the Soviet Union. So even though the cause of the British miners' strike was promoted by the Soviet press and so on, but some workers managed to see it not as a cause that is promoted by the Soviet state, but as a workers' cause. So there were even some attempts, also at later strikes in Soviet history, to like some strike leaders suggested to write to foreign workers and ask them for their solidarity in turn. Of course, also internationalism as an anti-xenophobic project could also go terribly wrong. from the Bolshevik perspective, or actually from any other perspective. For example, when the talk of world revolution was taken up by anti-Semites to be included into, like, to be incorporated into theories of worldwide Jewish conspiracy. So you have a public speaker speaking about world revolution, and then there is a heckler from the audience saying, like, yeah, well, it's a Jewish world revolution. Why don't the Jews care about it, and why should we care about it? Yeah, these are instances that were reported from such meetings. So all in all, internationalism as a prominent feature in mass agitprop potentially could cause more trouble than usefulness for the regime. A fact that has to be considered when thinking about the abolishment of internationalism under Stalin. Internationalism was not just too arcane for the population, because much of the historiography goes along the lines of, well, this talk of world revolution was it was not clear enough for the masses, so Stalin had to switch over to the rather nation-centered agenda. There is, of course, some truth in this. Of course, talk about events that are about to happen or are happening in some faraway countries. Of course, this is not as understandable and as close to people's concerns as some local issues. But all in all, internationalism was also too unruly. Like you could not foresee what the population would do with these informations and with these calls for international solidarity. So this is one more factor why under Stalin there was a switch in agitprop towards national topics. And I see I am already almost running out of time. So I will try to keep now my final part really short. Namely, of course, the question arises: what happened to internationalism in Soviet society in this really, really important transition period between NEP and Stalinism, between one could say between 1923 and 1927 or 28. Of course, during the 1920s, even when the Stalinist line of socialism in one country and so on got more and more upper hand. Even then, the regime still kept revolutionary internationalism in its agitprop arsenal, and it had to keep it because, on the one hand, the October Revolution's foundational myth is, of course, based also on internationalism, and also internationalism served as an outlet for popular cosmopolitanism, while the Soviet Union itself being increasingly isolated, like from the inside. The imaginary of a global revolutionary struggle produced the feeling of the Soviet Union being part of a global community, of a global revolutionary community. And this was, of course, very important also for early Stalinist propaganda, because in reality the Soviet Union got more and more closed off, like in cultural terms and so on. So what we can observe in the 1920s is a institutionalization and an enclosure of internationalism. So you have specialized organizations like the MOPR, translated it means Международная организация помощи борцам революции, international organization for the help to help the revolutionaries abroad, like this. It was a mass organization where people could become members for a really small fee, actually, and were supposed to participate in solidarity campaigns and display also like own initiative and develop own activities, which which in the end went nowhere, not only because of Stalinism, but because the organization was so strongly bureaucratically controlled that even if activists wanted to develop some initiative, due to this strict control, it couldn't really go nowhere. but so I really have to cut down the part on the 1920s. I mean, we can talk about it in the discussion perhaps, but just to sum up, internationalism as a not just as an idea, but also as a set of practices, as a set of discourses in Soviet society, did not just disappear because it was decreed away by Stalin, so to say. It also didn't survive the first decade of Soviet power because, on the one hand, because, of course, the developments abroad gave not much cause for hope, but also because its inherent contradictions. Internationalism and the belief in world revolution as a charismatic idea intensely bound to personal engagement, like we could see in the diaries of these activists. I mean, it's a personal decision to pick up this firm belief in world revolution. It could not, as such a charismatic idea, it could not go hand in hand with a society that was more and more isolated in the course of the 1920s, and not even to speak about the 30s, and of course also stifled by bureaucracy. In the end, as we all know, internationalism turned into an empty slogan under Stalinism and beyond, also in the post-Stalinist period. So it was invoked again and again, but with very different meanings behind it, and almost randomly. It could be employed to point towards the presumed multi-ethnic unity of the Soviet Empire, like internationalism as in brotherhood of the peoples within Soviet borders, which did not have much to do with what internationalism meant in the early Soviet discourse. Or it could also be used to justify military interventions from Hungary over Prague to Afghanistan, with the formula of internationalny dolg, the international commitment that the Soviet Union is taking up, or even those soldiers who, for example, participated in the invasion of Afghanistan were called Vojny internationaliste, like internationalist fighters. So in the end, it could mean everything and nothing. However, revolutionary internationalism in its original, class-based and form that was pointing towards this hope for international, for a global communist commonwealth, it did not disappear completely. Of course, it was sidelined by Stalinism, but it continued to fuel opposition and dissent throughout large periods of Soviet history, beginning with the left opposition, of course. And also after 1953, these ideas from the revolutionary period in the early 20s about international brotherhood and so on became a starting point for many dissidents and independent thinkers, as can be, for example, observed in the writings of Lev Kopelev or Varlam Shalamov. For many of them, the early Soviet revolutionary internationalism was a positive point of reference to pointing to the Soviet Union's cosmopolitan and outwards looking beginnings. Before most dissidents then deposed of any positive references to the Soviet experience altogether. But in the beginning, I missed a few slides. Yeah, this is the slide actually I wanted to show you this quote from Lev Kopelev, the famous Soviet dissident and writer. So for him and for others, the dreams of international brotherhood on the one hand were simplifying and so on, but the same dreams helped us to stay alive under Stalinism and beyond. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you. Fascinating, absolutely. Enormous amount of stuff to think about. Okay, so who would like to get started with the questions? Okay. Yeah, Pam? And we'll take a few at a time. Okay. Okay.
Right, so as you were talking, thank you very much, I was constantly thinking of how these lessons, or well, if you can draw any lessons to apply to today, I was thinking very much of this whole question of internationalism. And I've just come back from a Labour Party conference where there were some really interesting developments. And I think we can learn from this history of the struggle for internationalism in the Bolsheviks also today. So there was a big apparent scandal about anti-Semitism in the party. And there were sort of two sides. The Zionist side was saying that anyone who criticized Israel and supported the Palestinians necessarily was anti-Semitic, and the press made a big deal of this. So, you know, thinking about this whole period and what happened in the 20s and 30s, I think was really important education, especially for a lot of the young people here, who are, you know, really pleased to see a lot of these young people. So that what happened under Stalin, the change from internationalism to nationalism is crucial for us today. And the betrayal, for instance, I'm thinking of 1933, where it was called the third period of Stalinism. They said, well, first Hitler and then us. And then, as you mentioned, the Spanish Civil War, where ostensibly the Soviet Union was supporting the Spanish workers, but in fact they didn't give them the weapons they needed. You know, you can read a bit about it in George Orwell's Catalonia. So this is really important stuff.
Do you want to ask a question, Pam?
Yeah, okay, anti-Semitism and Zionism, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
It's a little bit outside your time period, but it surprised me to hear so much about internationalism being cancelled by Stalin in the 20s, when actually it was wrecked in 1914. So there's a process of attempting to recover the Communist International with the Russian Revolution, which we know as a national revolution, which leads in, you've pointed out, to an international empire, because that's its inheritance, and it has to fight off rival empires, almost from the off. So I just wonder if you comment on 1914 in relation to internationalism as it's kind of re-understood after the Soviet Revolution.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, one of the things that I was thinking about when you were giving the talk was the question of different periods, and we're talking in the rapid moving situation from 1917 up to 1923, 1924. And I would anticipate that you would find that great support for international revolution and amongst popular consciousness in the early years. But surely, and I'm wondering whether you find this, that come 1920, 21, the NEP and everything, the workers who've made the Russian Revolution are either dead in the Civil War, or absorbed into the bureaucracy of the state, or essentially dropped out of politics completely. And the people who were just about in the Bolshevik Party by the 20s are people who've joined after the revolution. You've got this growing bureaucratization. And therefore, in a way, do you find less popular support for notions of the international revolution between 1917 and 1920-21? And a corollary, or an addendum to that. In terms of the German Revolution, we do know that there was a lot of equivocation by the certain factions within the Russian leadership about the German Revolution. They were unwilling to send Trotsky to Germany because they thought it boosted him against Stalin. The German party was all over the place because of the various disasters it had been involved with. Does that inform the propaganda for solidarity with the German Revolution? Is that equivocation found inside that or not?
Right.
Mhm.
Brendan, people need to speak into the mic at the back. Is that what
Yeah,
you're...
people in the
because for
room downstairs can't hear.
Oh,
Good.
okay.
So,
There's a mic at the back. So if you want to ask, if Liz asks you to speak,
yeah.
can you go
Sorry,
over
just,
there, please?
yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Should we take one more, or you?
Perhaps it would make sense to.
You want to do this now? These
Or-
questions.
Okay.
One
well,
more.
yeah,
One
if you,
more.
if you
Okay,
say
I
so.
saw
one
someone
more.
at the back there.
Can you come out?
Speak into the mic. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Can you just
Please.
repeat the question when you answer it? That might be a bit easier.
Oh, it's not like I memorized the exact wording of the question, but I'll try.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Chance of opening a window. I'm boiling up.
I know, it's open. And there's also a fan, I know, it's not, maybe that door, if we prop that, can that door be propped open? Might help a little with air. Okay, thanks, anyway. Okay, whoever,
He's there.
oh, there you are, okay.
Do I?
Okay, carry on.
My question to you is, so you talked a lot about world revolution.
Hmm? Could you speak up a bit? Because unfortunately, like the mic doesn't connect to me.
You talked a lot about world revolution and Stalinist views on it. So I've got two questions, but they're basically the same thing. My first question is, why were all these people during Stalin's era that you spoke about, why were they so fascinated about world revolution, understanding that Stalin gave up on the idea of socialism in one country? And my second question is, why was Comintern so dominant despite the fact that Stalin gave up on internationalist views and came with socialism in one country?
Thank you, very interesting, okay. Good luck. Just a few points,
Mhm.
yes.
Okay, so yeah, many important questions raised, many interesting points made. Yeah, perhaps first the question about 1914. Well, didn't internationalism die in 1914? Of course it did. 1914 was the failure of Second International Social Democracy to live up to what they were basically saying in Basel in 1912 and so on. I mean, of course, it's the prehistory of what we have here. But then again, for rank and file activists in Russia, the debates of the Second International were not that crucial. I mean, those people, those rank and file activists one usually encounters in early Soviet society, they were not necessarily firm in the debates of the Second International. For them, the crucial event, the decisive event was 1914, but not as in betrayal of social democracy and so on, but rather as in, well, the war itself. I mean, the war itself pointed many of those who became activists in the revolution and in early Soviet society towards the idea of internationalism, because it was seen as a natural antidote against war, even without taking into account any debates the Second International could have had. I hope this kind of answers it. Then I don't know anymore who asked the question about well, one could say about political generations. Like, of course, I think it was your question, right? By 1921, well, of course, you have different people and different proportions of people in the party than in 1917 or than in 1918. And I mean, there's many literature written on that, including the great book by Simon Pirani, who is downstairs. Yeah. So yes, you are right. Of course, there are very different people in the party by then, but not on all levels, and especially not on those levels that mattered in terms of like producing content producing, I don't know, leaflets, speeches, political directives in the end. Because this turnover, it didn't happen as quickly in the, like among the, how to say, like, in Russian you would say ответственные работники. So like party people who are responsible for tasks, yeah, like those who are, for example, agitators or newspaper producers and so on. Because there you still rather had the generation of 1917, and of course together with their ideals and their beliefs and their assumptions about world affairs. And actually the Soviet press is a very interesting example, because it was not that uniform as we might imagine it later on. Of course it was like all within within the general party line, but still provincial Soviet newspapers were really interesting and strange newspapers actually, and so they had to be brought into line with the general party line, not just under Stalinism but already from the very beginning. I mean, Lenin was arguing all the time for a local press that does not rant about world revolution, that does tackle the everyday affairs of the population of this particular village or this particular town. And it's very interesting to observe this struggle between periphery and center that went on basically until the mid-1920s. And this struggle to discipline the press, it went along the lines of whether to write about world revolution and how to write about world revolution. This also shows that, like, one can't really say that, okay, there were these people in 1917, 1918, and then in 1921 there are completely different people in the party. This is of course a process that goes throughout the whole 1920s. To the question about, I'm really sorry, I didn't understand completely the first part of your question, so I'll tackle the second one and then you can intervene if it didn't answer your first one. I mean, why was the Comintern still so important in Soviet and in international history if Stalin gave up on world revolution, or however one would phrase it? The thing is, of course, that, well, one could say the Comintern had basically two strengths, if it's possible to say it like that in English. So on the one hand, it was a very symbolic institution. When it was founded in 1919, or especially during its follow-up congresses in 1920, particularly in 1920, it was looked upon over, well, one could say over the whole globe as a sort of completely new organization. So before that you had the Second International, the Social Democratic International, that basically failed to stop the war in 1914. And now the Comintern, the Communist International, stepped on the scene with a completely new promise. With a promise of, well, not failing like that, basically. Of course it had many other programmatic features and many other promises. But perhaps the most attractive one is that it will not fail like the Second International failed in 1914. So this was like the symbolic power of the Comintern. The other power of the Comintern compared to the Second International, for example, which was just a loose gathering of parties basically, was that the Comintern tried hard to enforce discipline on its member parties. So the communist parties in the all over the world, those who aligned themselves to the Comintern were considered sections of one party basically. So the Comintern was like the party of, well, the party of the world proletariat, while the world party of the proletariat, while, for example, the Communist Party of Great Britain was just a section of this party. So on the one hand, of course, in theory, it would allow these new communist parties that were quite small in most of the countries and also rather irrelevant, that would allow them to operate more strongly, more more efficiently, but of course it meant immense bureaucratic control. Also, the foreign communist parties, of course, received financial help from the Comintern, but which was basically coming, of course, from the Soviet Communist Party, because it was the only party in power, the only party that had the resources even to host an organization like the Comintern on its own soil. It was originally planned to move the Comintern to Berlin pretty quickly. Like, if World Revolution would succeed, and of course, first of all in Germany, and this is why the internal language of the executive committee of the Comintern in its protocols was German up to the late 1930s, like out of this very early belief. So, but to tackle your question, so why did Stalin not abolish the Comintern altogether? Because, of course, it was a very efficient instrument of foreign policy. It was an amazing apparatus with its own, well, one could say with its own secret service, the Отдел, the Department of International Relations, with like agents and activists all over the globe. And it was still a organization that still held, still was attractive in the eyes of many communists and fellow travelers in the West, because it still carried this charisma of a massive global revolutionary organization. So of course Stalin would be quite stupid to abolish it altogether that quickly. Also, I mean, we cannot argue that strictly that like Stalin was I mean, it's a question whether Stalin still believed in something like international solidarity or not. I mean, we cannot definitely say, we cannot look into Stalin's head. And of course, the Soviet Union still supported foreign revolutions in the late 1920s and 1930s, even though quite selfishly, like in the Spanish case, where they armed the Spanish Republic in exchange for Spain, for the Republic's gold reserves. But I guess, yeah, I've said enough about the Comintern, I guess. For is there anything I did not tackle in your twofold question?
No, it's just I was asking about the people, about like
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, we still can't hear up here.
Yeah, no, there were the people that you showed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was asking why they should believe the World Revolution, while Stalin didn't. As if they didn't get the idea that Stalin was for socialism in their own country. But you answered that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. Brendan has some questions from the other room.
Oh, okay.
Or a question from the other room.
So the question from the other room downstairs is, what role do you think internationalism played with regard to economic and political gains abroad after Stalin? Example, Cuba and in later Soviet history.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, do you remember, go back, if you don't mind, going back to the back.
So with that quote from Gleb up there, you said that hope is like increasingly important to
Sorry,
keeping
speak
people
up a bit.
for keeping people alive. But how significant was this hope in the eventual realization of the Soviet Union and in acquiring political support?
I'm really sorry. It's the acoustics in this room are really not like people in the other room can hear you, but I cannot hear you. That's the problem. I'm really sorry.
So I just wanted to know how significant was this hope for the eventual world revolution in maintaining and acquiring political support and compliance to the regime.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. There was one other. Yes. Okay. Thanks very much.
I was wondering if you could speak about whether there was some kind of revival of this ideology in the original sense of world revolution that you spoke about in 1945, when a lot of the Eastern European states were brought within the Soviet satellite.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, do you want to deal with those?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I saw you. Next bunch, okay? Your first next bunch.
Okay, so basically 2 of these 3 questions deal with the post-war period, and the third one deals with how important was the concept. I hope I understood it correctly. How important was internationalism in securing popular support within early Soviet Russia, right? Okay, so I will start with this one, like in chronological terms. It's hard to say really, like if whether the Bolshevik belief in world revolution and the propagation of world revolution within Soviet society, whether it pushed people away from them or attracted people to them. Both movements are possible, of course. If you read diaries and memoirs of like old intellectuals and like adherents of the old order who were living in the early Soviet state, of course they ridicule the concept of world revolution and these hopes as completely insane, and like it's like for them it's rather like a proof of the craziness of the Bolsheviks. But it gets quite interesting when, at particular points of time, when it indeed seems for a very short time that the Bolsheviks were right. For example, when the first news about the German Revolution of 1918 come in. And there, for example, I stumbled upon it in a diary of, what was his name, Georgy Knyazyev, I think, a librarian in Petrograd. Well, a progressive guy by early 1917 standards, but of course a staunch non-supporter of the Bolsheviks. And then he reads about the news of the November Revolution, and he writes in his diary, well, probably we were wrong. We made fun of the Bolsheviks because they believed that in Germany the workers would rise, and now it seems they are right. Of course, I mean, a few months later, probably he had all reasons to write that, well, I was right in the end and the Bolsheviks were wrong. But in these particular moments, when European history seemed to give justice to the Bolshevik expectations, then this internationalist agenda could be important for, or could work as getting more people on the side of the new regime. And of course, considering the rank and file activists, I mean, as a for them it was of course a very important how you say? I'm sorry, I'm already losing my English slowly. For them, of course, Bolshevik internationalism was a very important argument to become rank and file activists for the party and that means for the new regime. For example, the aforementioned Iosif Golubyov. I mean, when he joins the party in March 1917, so shortly after the February Revolution in Minsk, the first thing that he writes about in his diary about the party he just joined, and in fact he joined still the United Social Democratic Party, because in Minsk the Russian Social Democratic Party split up in Bolsheviks and Mensheviks only in mid-1917, and he became a Bolshevik. But he joins the party when it's still basically a social democratic party, united one. And he writes, well, something along the lines of, well, I joined the Party of International Brotherhood. and like we are against the war and so on and so forth. So for him, it's probably not the economic reasonings, not the theory, but exactly this internationalist sentiment. Okay, to deal with the questions on post-war history, even though I have to warn that I'm not really an expert on post-war, Cold War history. So first of all, the question, how important this like old internationalist or world revolutionary discourse was for the Soviet Union's diplomatic gains and like gains of foreign policy after 1945. Cuba was mentioned, for example. And I think this goes along the lines with your question, right? So how was there any sort of revival of an like internationalist discourse in the 1910s, 1920s sense? It's also hard to say, really. Of course, the obvious answer would be no, because, and this is a transformation unfortunately I didn't talk much about in my talk, but there's a very important shift in Soviet discourse that occurs already in the late 20s and even more so in the 30s. Namely, when the talk of class gets replaced by the talk of people. This is a very important point for the history of the internationalist discourse. David Brandenberger has written a lot about it, so if you're really interested in that question, it's really worth to consult his works. For example, if you look at how the Spanish Civil War was portrayed in Pravda and in other newspapers, it's always, or almost always, the talk about the heroic Spanish people who are fighting against Franco, against foreign intervention and so on. Class discourse is almost completely absent from contemporary Soviet writings on the Spanish Civil War. However, if you look at these letters that are kept in the Comintern archive in Moscow, ordinary citizens writing to the Comintern asking to be sent to Spain, and none of them was sent to Spain, needless to say, because the Soviet Union did not send random volunteers to Spain, but only trained specialists and so on. Those letters, they employ still very strongly the discourse of international class solidarity. So they show that these slogans, and also not just the slogans, but also parts of this mindset, did survive in a popular communist discourse, one could say. So these letters, they are. I looked at a few hundred of them in this particular archival unit, and they feature the discourse of class nearly as strongly as, or even sometimes even stronger than the discourse of people and of nation. While if you look at the official internationalist discourse already in the late 20s, it was mostly a discourse of nations and peoples. And of course, while this has already quite little to do with the discourse of the early 20s, this particular discourse of people's solidarity, or solidarity with particular peoples or with particular nations, of course came to full bloom after 1945. Well, I mean, this whole internationalist discourse within the Eastern Bloc was built on the notion of internationalism that is based on solidarity between peoples and between states. So it's this transformation that was really important for 1945, but there was, I mean, probably it would require additional studies, because, for example, there is one really fascinating study on the clubs of international friendship by Yulia Gradskova, a Russian sociologist, where she looks at these so-called clubs of international friendship in 1970s, 1980s Soviet Union. These were like it was a mass organization with cells at universities and so on. And they were supposed to function like the MOPR functioned in the 1920s, like conducting solidarity campaigns with Nicaragua and with and so on. And her study shows that while for most participants of these clubs of international friendship, it was just a sort of necessary step within a functionary's career. For a smaller yet still substantial number of participants, these clubs of international friendship were more. They were about, for example, about the hope of being sent to Nicaragua actually, even though this hardly, I don't even know whether it happened or it hardly ever happened. But many joined these clubs in order to go and fight, like on the correct side in Nicaragua, or do some solidarity work abroad. So, like on the level of social history, there still was something left, of course, but not that much anymore on level of like diplomacy and state policy.
Okay, thanks very much, Gleb. We'll take one more round. There was somebody back there. I said you'd be first. Yes, okay. And then those two people. Okay, and that's we're gonna let go then.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
So you've talked a lot about Germany, and a lot of my family are old Italian communists. So I wanted to ask about if you could talk about the Bolshevik influence during the Biennio Rosso, and whether the failure of these 2 years directly led to the rise of Mussolini. And then you've also spoken a lot about global revolution in Europe, and I wanted to ask whether there was an impact of Bolsheviks, whether the Bolshevik ideas impacted South America as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, I couldn't see who was. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Originally, the October Revolution was seen as, and the Soviet regime was seen as depending upon international revolution for its very survival. But by 1923, with the failure in Germany, which was seen as the key country for a revolution in Europe, and with the fact that the Soviet regime survived beyond that, then you had the theory of socialism in one country coming in within a year or so of that. Was there a change in the feeling that international revolution was not so much because the regime was surviving and the economy was reviving under the Enlightenment, there was a feeling that international revolution was decreasingly necessary and more of a case of something that was worthwhile rather than absolutely vital? And how that impacted on various levels, within the party and within the population. If you could say something like that, that'd be great.
Thanks. Yeah, I can't see very well back there, but go ahead.
As a student of both history and political theory, I'm interested in this tension you get both in theory and practice between internationalism and in some respects it's very opposite, its antithesis, nationalism. And this is a tension which is revealed in many ways during the course of this period of Soviet history, right from the coup, because I don't believe there was a revolution frankly in October. I think it was a coup. The real revolution for me was in February of that year. But leaving that to one side, both from 1917 right through to 1927. So what I'm interested to know is, in terms of from the perspective of the rank and file and from members of the party, how was this tension reconciled between nationalist feelings, if you are, for example, a Central Asian Muslim, or you're from the Caucasus, or you are a Ukrainian? So how did these people reconcile their nationalist sentiments with their at least theoretical commitment to some form of internationalism?
Thanks
Mhm.
very much.
Thanks very much. That's very important.
Okay. We'll make this the last one. Okay?
Need to sort the notes.
Yes.
Okay, amazing questions. Thanks a lot. I have to disappoint you, unfortunately, as concerning the Biennio Rosso and Mussolini, because I'm really not a specialist in Italian communist history. What I know is that the events were they were much talked about in the Soviet press. Many activists were concerned about what was going on in Italy. Particularly, I mean, I did not systematically gather material on how the situation in Italy was reflected upon in the early Soviet Union. But like in the end, when Mussolini came to power, and the repressions that unleashed afterwards, this was getting very much attention in Soviet society, and particularly among activists who were actually, at least I think I found one letter of some provincial Soviet activists writing to, I think actually it was to Trotsky personally, to inquire like what is the faith of the Italian labor movement now. And then actually Trotsky indeed makes the effort of writing to some Italian communists he knew who were in Moscow at that time, to at least to be able to prepare a proper answer. Apparently, I haven't found the letter of Trotsky himself yet. I don't know whether he really answered it, but this particular letter from this otherwise unknown activists provoked Trotsky to make inquiries with these Italian communists about the concrete situation in Italy. Concerning South America, of course, South American history is also not really my field, but what I was able to grasp from studies dealing with the Latin American labor movement. Communism played, of course, a very important role, and not just in the post-war period, but already from the very beginning, from the very beginning of the interwar period. While, of course, on the other hand, as far as I remember, and judging from what I have read, the history of the Latin American communist parties is also one that is very much shaped by internal strife and by competing groups and by, well, a lot of internal conflict, and of course a lot of external pressure as well, given that we have several dictatorships in Latin American countries at that period of time, with communist parties being illegal. So of course the Comintern, South America was a very important field of activity. But there is brilliant literature on that subject, with much more information than I can offer. Okay, then the question on whether there was a shift in popular perceptions, if I understood you correctly, like from the feeling that world revolution is necessary to the feeling that world revolution would be like a nice to have, but not necessarily a precondition. Yes, one can indeed observe such a shift after 1923 and after this completely counterproductive campaign of 1923, where the whole population was prepared for a revolution in Germany and nothing came out of it. And afterwards, I mean, there was a comparable campaign accompanying the British miners' strike and also the short general strike of 1926. The campaign was conducted by very similar means to the campaign of 1923. So you had newspaper articles, you had like speakers touring the provinces, telling the people about British general strike and so on. You had money collections for the strikers But this campaign turned out to be much less convincing, even though it managed to gather some enthusiasm in the beginning, and there was quite some money collected for the British workers actually. But the campaign faded out very quickly because there's nowhere in this campaign was there any word about like why this strike is supposed to be important for the Soviet Union, or why it's supposed to be like, of course it's important, but it was never said that this strike is a matter of life and death for the Soviet Union. So if you look at the responses to this campaign from below, you find a lot of like letters and questions at public meetings and so on, saying like why should we pay the British workers? Like they are not helping us. They did not help us. We expected them to help us, but they never did. Of course, some things are already forgotten, like the British dock workers' blockade of weapons for Poland in 1921 and so on. But this doesn't play a role anymore. So there is not much understanding among these reactions, like why exactly is it important to help? So in the end, one could say that these campaigns could develop like some real traction only when it could be shown convincingly that this particular strike, this particular revolution, whatever, abroad meant something really crucial for Soviet everyday life and for the future of the country. Yeah, and in fact, if you look at the Spanish Civil War and the solidarity, the inner Soviet solidarity campaign during the Spanish Civil War, I don't think there is much discourse about the crucialness of the fight against Franco for the Soviet Union itself. Like there are many historical parallels. There is much talk going on about how Spain is experiencing the same kind of civil war we experienced 15 years ago and so on. But it's not much about why the victory over Franco in Spain is really important for Soviet society. This is not an issue anymore. It doesn't matter anymore, basically. Then the really important and really crucial question about the contradictions and the conflicts between nationalism and internationalism. Of course, I mean, this is a huge question. One could debate it on the level of political theory. One could debate it on level of diplomacy, of Soviet diplomacy, of high politics. What I can say from a perspective like on Soviet society from below, one could say, is that this contradiction was strongly felt throughout the period, particularly as a contradiction between internationalist proclamations and grassroots xenophobia, anti-Semitism, all sorts of like ethnic or religion-based prejudices. And this is a contradiction that is uttered very often in letters of agitprop functionaries, activists, and so on. But no one really knows what to do about it. Actually, the Bolshevik party apparatus seems quite helpless in countering these racist, xenophobic reactions towards talk about world revolution. Like I brought up this example in my talk, where the speaker speaks about world revolution and hecklers heckle that it's a Jewish project and so on. Of course, one could like arrest these people, one could ban these people from the room, etc., etc. But on the level of like how to deal with it in terms of strategy, there was not much besides the hope that while hearing about struggles abroad, people will become more tolerant and so on. And of course, Another important issue, which I only started working on only recently, so it's not part of my book, but preliminary, one could say, if one would look at how internationalist agitprop and internationalist content functioned in like non-European areas of the Soviet Union, one could say it was a pretty much different internationalist propaganda than in the European parts of the Soviet Union. There was quite some orientalization going on, one could say. In terms of, for example, if you look at the posters that were produced by the MOPR, by the International Association to Help Political Prisoners Abroad, if you look at the posters that were produced for Central Asia, they look a lot different from the posters that were supposed to attract like Russian or Ukrainian workers and peasants to the cause of the MOPR. So you have really a very orientalized imagery in this visual production, which was in many cases actually produced by Russian artists and by Russian activists who imagined that this is the way how to reach this population. Or, for example, there were several debates on regional level with, like for example, in the region of Astrakhan, I stumbled upon a party journal where there is a debate about, by regional functionaries and activists, there is a debate about what language to use, Tatar language or Russian language in party education. And it's interesting, those who are arguing that, of course, the Tatar party activists, they all have to learn Russian, is because it says literally, it's the language of world revolution. Through the Russian language, the Tatar activists will get access to the global communist imaginary. And this is of course very interesting. While it's still very benevolent, one could say, probably these activists really believe that the usage of Russian language will enable the Tatar activists to participate more strongly in international culture. But at the same time, of course, it's a rather patronizing and rather like a patronizing way of dealing with non-European culture in the Soviet Union. And also it's like it constructs hierarchies. Like the Russian people are more close to the world proletariat than the Tatars or the Uzbeks or whoever. So one could say that many of the inequalities that we have already in the 1930s and in the post-war Soviet Union regarding national policy, and which were subsumed under the label of internationalism as well. Like if you read Soviet literature on proletarsky internationalism, what was published in the 70s or the 80s, it deals mostly with inter-ethnic relations in the Soviet Union. And one could a bit polemically argue that many of the inequalities that were inherent to post-Soviet internationalism, they were already there in how the Russian Bolsheviks tried to enact internationalism in the 20s in the non-European parts of the Soviet Union. Sorry for the very long sentence.
No, you have your English, by the way, is excellent.
It's getting
totally
worse and worse during the evening.
Okay, I think we're going to wind up now, and I guess ask Gleb if you had any last, I mean, you've spoken a great deal, but if you have any final comments you wanted to make before we call it.
First of all, thank you very much for the insightful questions, and it's great to see that the topic really matters to the many people in the audience. And I'm just sorry that I couldn't bring all important, or perhaps how to say, I hope an English translation of my book comes out at some point, and then perhaps you will get a fuller picture, because of course what I said is superficial in parts and not as detailed as it could be. But
thank you very much. fascinating, I think. The next talk, can I just say, the next talk is on the 12th of October, so sooner, not the last Thursday, the 12th of October. It's Dr. Lara Dowd speaking about Lenin's living link with the people, question mark, the Soviet government's reception, 1917 to 1924. And just briefly, Lenin's reception was a means by which ordinary citizens could make contact with the government. Soviet statesmen referred to it as the living link between government and people, but it actually became a form of control. Nevertheless, workers and peasants learned how to play the game and use the system. So her talk will be about that. The details are on Eventbrite, but it is important to note it's the 12th of October, so it's earlier than these have been. Then on the 23rd of November, just briefly, a discussion which will reflect on the whole series, which should be very, very interesting. It'll be opened by Simon Perroni, but everybody will be invited to participate fully in that and fill in a questionnaire, which has been circulated, or will be circulated, about the issues that we want to talk about. Then there's couple of extra talks, I guess. The 30th of November, Wendy Goldman will be talking on the family, free love, and the Russian Revolution. And then there's an extra added date on Thursday, the 18th of January. The first speaker, Steve Smith, has been invited back because a new edition of his book on workers' organizations in the revolution, Red Petrograd, is being published. And so he's coming back as a last session. So there's still a lot to look forward to. And so I hope everybody will keep coming. And thank you very, very much for coming along.